Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Kara stood before the Nightmare Tower, its jagged spires cutting into the dark sky. Legends told of those who had entered, their minds filled with horror and dread, never to return. The tower loomed over the surrounding forest, casting long, creeping shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. Kara shivered, not from the chill in the air, but from the weight of the place. It had claimed many, including her mentor, Garen. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly. This journey wasn't just about proving her worth as a wizard apprentice, it was personal. She had to know what had happened to Garen. He had been her guiding light, the man who had believed in her when no one else did. Losing him had left an aching hole in her heart, and that emptiness had driven her to this moment. No one had expected her to take up the challenge, least of all the elders at the academy. But Kara wasn't like other students. She had always been drawn to the study of fear, how it worked, how it could be manipulated, how it could be conquered. Now, as she stood on the edge of the unknown, she had to rely on every lesson, every insight into the human psyche. She had to believe that fear could be unraveled, that it could be understood and overcome. Her fingers clenched around the smooth wood of her staff as she took a step forward. The ground beneath her boots felt unnervingly soft, as if the earth itself recoiled from the tower. She pushed the thought aside and focused on the massive black doors ahead. They were intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize, but she could sense their power. It was old magic, deep and dangerous. She hesitated only for a moment, then pushed the door open. The darkness inside was suffocating, pressing in from all sides as soon as she stepped across the threshold. It wasn't natural darkness. This was thick, alive, and cold, like stepping into the void between dreams and nightmares. Her heartbeat quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Fear thrives on uncertainty, and the more she let it sink in, the more dangerous this place would become. Her staff glowed faintly in the gloom, casting a dim, greenish light around her. She walked forward, the sound of her boots echoing in the silence. After several paces, the walls of the tower began to close in. She could feel the weight of the tower bearing down on her, as if it knew she was there and was tightening its grip. Then, out of the shadows, something moved. Kara's breath caught as a figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, hooded figure with no face, its body made of swirling black mist. The air around it was cold, colder than the rest of the room. Fear gripped her stomach, but she held her ground, gripping her staff tightly. The figure didn't speak, but Kara felt its presence deep in her bones. It was a manifestation of fear itself, feeding on the energy she gave it. She had studied this, understood it, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, trying to steady her voice. But the figure seemed to grow larger, the shadows around it twisting and spiraling outward, filling the space. Kara felt her pulse quicken, her skin prickling with cold sweat. The more she tried to deny the fear, the stronger the figure became. She closed her eyes, blocking out the towering figure before her. Fear was not something to be fought, it was something to be understood. Her mentor had taught her that. Fear thrives on the unknown, on the mind's tendency to fill in the blanks with the worst possibilities. Kara opened her eyes. "You're not real," she said softly. "You're just a reflection of what I fear. You have no power over me unless I let you." The figure paused, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, it began to shrink, the mist receding. Kara stood her ground, keeping her mind clear, her breath steady. The figure dissolved entirely, leaving only a cold draft behind. She exhaled, relieved. But she knew this was only the beginning. Moving deeper into the tower, the path twisted and turned, leading her through corridors that seemed to shift and change behind her. Her staff continued to glow faintly, illuminating the narrow space just ahead. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of movement, flickers of shadows darting through the walls, whispers of sound just beyond her reach. As she reached the next floor, the walls melted away into a grand hall lined with mirrors. Each one was as tall as her, standing like a silent sentinel. Kara stopped, her reflection staring back at her from all directions. At first glance, the reflections were normal. But as she moved closer, she realized something was wrong. Each reflection showed a different version of herself. In one, she was frail and broken, clutching her staff with trembling hands. In another, her face was twisted in pain, her body covered in scars. There were dozens of versions, each one depicting a failure, a mistake, a moment of weakness. Kara's throat tightened. The images were too real, too close to the truth. The mirrors weren't just reflecting her, they were showing her deepest fears. Fear of failure. Fear of letting down the people who counted on her. Fear of being weak, of being broken. The whispers began again, soft at first, but growing louder with every passing second. You're not ready. You'll never make it. Look at yourself. Do you really think you can defeat this place? The voices surrounded her, feeding her insecurities, gnawing at her confidence. Kara felt the walls of her mind closing in. The mirrors reflected not just her failures, but her doubts, her self-loathing. She wanted to turn away, to smash the mirrors, to make the voices stop, but deep down, she knew that wouldn't work. Destroying the mirrors wouldn't change the truth. The fear wasn't in the glass, it was in her. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she closed her eyes, remembering what Garen had always told her. Failure isn't the end. It's part of the journey. Every misstep, every mistake is a lesson. It's not the failures that define you, it's how you rise after them. Kara opened her eyes, meeting her own reflection in the mirror. She stared at the broken, scarred version of herself. "You're not me," she whispered, her voice steady. "You're a possibility, but not a certainty." The reflection flickered, its form shifting and blurring. Kara straightened her shoulders. "I'm not perfect, and I'll make mistakes. But that doesn't mean I'll fail." The mirror shattered, sending a wave of cold air rushing through the room. One by one, the other mirrors followed suit, cracking and crumbling until the room was empty, save for the echo of Kara's breathing. She stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around her. The fear of failure was a powerful one, but she had faced it head-on and survived. There were more trials ahead, but each one would bring her closer to the truth. With a determined step, she moved forward, ascending to the next level. The air grew heavier as she climbed. This time, the tower didn't lead her into a dark hall or a twisting corridor. Instead, she found herself in a place that made her heart stop. It was her childhood home. Kara's breath caught in her throat. The small, cozy house stood before her, just as it had when she was a little girl. The flowers her mother had planted in the garden were still blooming, their colors vibrant and warm. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the open window. It was all too real. She stepped forward, her feet moving automatically. The door creaked open as she approached, and inside, she saw her family. Her mother, her father, her younger brother, all sitting around the table, smiling and laughing. They looked so happy, so alive, but they weren't. Kara's chest tightened with grief. Her family had died years ago, taken from her in a tragedy she had never fully recovered from. And yet here they were, just as she remembered them, as if time had never touched them. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The tower was playing with her mind again, using her deepest pain against her. Her family turned to her, their smiles fading as they called her name. Kara, come home. Her heart ached. She wanted to run to them, to embrace them, to tell them how much she missed them. But she couldn't. She knew what this was. The tower was using her grief, her longing, to trap her. I can't stay, she whispered, her voice cracking. Her mother stood, walking toward her with open arms. Stay with us. You don't have to be alone anymore. Kara's knees buckled, but she stood firm. You're not real, she choked out. You're just an illusion. Her father rose next, his expression hardening. Is that what you think? That your family is just an illusion? The words cut deep, but Kara clenched her fists. I love you. But this isn't real. The house began to blur, the edges of the room flickering and distorting. Kara squeezed her eyes shut, letting the memories of her family fill her mind. She had already lost them once. She couldn't let this false reality keep her from her mission. I accept the past, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But I can't live in it. When she opened her eyes again, the house was gone. The familiar warmth had faded, replaced by the cold stone walls of the tower. Kara wiped her face with the back of her hand, her body trembling from the emotional weight of the encounter. The tower was relentless, but so was she. Each trial tested her resolve, her ability to confront the darkest parts of herself. But each time, she grew stronger. Finally, she reached the top. The final chamber was nothing like she had expected. There were no monsters, no illusions, no traps. Just a single figure standing in the middle of the room, her mentor, Garen. Kara's heart leaped in her chest. Garen, she cried, rushing toward him, but as she drew closer, she realized something was wrong. Garen didn't move, didn't smile. He stood there, still as stone, his eyes empty. Kara, his voice was hollow, distant. You shouldn't have come. She froze, her blood running cold. What do you mean? Garen's gaze darkened. The tower, it's not what you think. It doesn't just trap you in nightmares. It feeds on them. It feeds on fear. Kara shook her head. No, I've faced my fears. I've beaten them. Garen's expression softened, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. You've done well, Kara. But the tower doesn't care about victory or defeat. It only cares about feeding. And now it has me, and you. Kara's heart pounded in her chest. No, that can't be true. Garen reached out, his hand trembling. The only way to free the souls trapped here is to accept what the tower is. To let go of the fear that holds us here. She stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. How? He smiled weakly. You already know the answer. You've known it all along. Kara's mind raced, her thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and grief. But then, slowly, clarity began to form. The tower had always been about fear, fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of the unknown. It wasn't about conquering those fears. It was about accepting them. Understanding that fear is a part of life, a part of who we are. She stepped forward, reaching out to Garen. I'm ready, she whispered. The moment her hand touched his, the room dissolved into light. Kara stood at the base of the nightmare tower once more, the dark spires crumbling into dust behind her. The souls trapped within had been freed, their fears finally laid to rest. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Kara smiled, knowing that she, too, had found peace.